In a world where prejudice hides behind polished smiles, one act of arrogance at a prestigious university will be shattered by the brilliance of a girl no one believed in. Stay till the end to witness how the truth humbled the proud, and how knowledge found its voice through silence. The grand hall of the Brazilian university shimmered with intellect and ego alike. Sunlight poured through the glass ceiling, dancing across the polished marble floor as rows of scholars whispered in anticipation. On the main stage stood a massive screen displaying the mysterious inscription, lines and symbols etched from a stone tablet recently unearthed in the mines of Minas Gerais. The world's leading linguists, historians, and anthropologists had gathered to solve it. Yet, after hours of debate, the hall remained filled with uncertainty and frustration. Every theory had fallen apart under scrutiny. The air felt heavy with embarrassment, and beneath the tension lingered a subtle arrogance, each expert afraid to admit defeat. Among the scattered staff cleaning up after the conference break was a young girl no older than 16. Her mother had worked there for years, scrubbing floors and arranging chairs, while the girl often helped on weekends for a little extra pay. She moved quietly, carrying a tray of empty coffee cups as the scholars' discussion grew louder and more agitated. From her corner, she watched the symbols glowing faintly on the screen, her dark eyes narrowing as though recognizing a forgotten melody. She didn't belong to their world of polished suits and academic applause, yet in that moment, something deep inside her stirred. A whisper from old stories her great-grandfather once told her on warm, quiet nights. At the front of the hall, the lead professor, a tall man with silver hair and an ego that filled the room, slammed his notes shut. His frustration turned to irritation, and irritation quickly to mockery. "We have over 30 experts here," he sneered, his voice echoing through the hall, "and not a single one can translate a few lines of stone?" A ripple of uneasy laughter followed. He scanned the audience, then his eyes landed on the cleaning girl standing still by the back wall. His smirk grew wider, crueler. "Perhaps we should ask for help from the staff," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe the maid's daughter has the answer we've missed." The room fell silent. The insult hung in the air like smoke, stinging every corner of the hall. The girl's mother froze mid-step, her face turning pale as the crowd chuckled softly, unsure whether to laugh or feel ashamed. The young girl lowered her gaze, clutching the tray a little tighter, her heart pounding, not from humiliation but from anger she dared not show. The professor's laugh filled the silence again. "Don't be shy," he continued mockingly. "If you have the answer, speak up." His words dripped with condescension, as if her silence proved him right. The scholars around him exchanged awkward glances, some uncomfortable, others amused. The room that once held pride now held poison. Yet the girl didn't walk away. Instead, she slowly placed the tray on a nearby table, her eyes drifting once more toward the projected inscription. She tilted her head slightly, tracing the lines in the air with her fingers as if connecting invisible threads. There was something hauntingly familiar about those shapes, the way one symbol curved into another, the rhythm of repetition between them. She remembered her great-grandfather's voice, deep and tender, teaching her the meaning of hidden words that once protected those who had nowhere else to go. He used to say their language was born from silence, built to survive in shadows. Her mother whispered urgently, begging her to ignore the insult and continue working, but the girl barely heard her. The hall had faded around her, the noise of laughter dissolving into a quiet hum in her ears. The symbols called to her, not as riddles but as memories. One mark meant path, another shelter, another freedom. Her breath caught. They weren't just words. They were fragments of the language her ancestors once used to guide each other through the forests when escaping the cruelty of chains. Meanwhile, the professor basked in his own arrogance, pacing across the stage with a smirk of victory. "As I thought," he said loudly, turning to the audience. "No response. Let's return to the real discussion." His voice, proud and polished, sought approval. But when he looked back toward the girl, he caught something unexpected, a steady gaze that no longer seemed frightened. She wasn't glaring in anger. She was watching him the way a teacher watches a careless student. For a moment he faltered, feeling a strange discomfort he couldn't name. The girl took a slow breath, her fingers brushing the notebook in her apron pocket. It was worn and yellowed, its edges frayed, but inside it held pages filled with strange markings. Her great-grandfather's writings. Notes she'd never fully understood until now. She realized the symbols on the screen weren't random. They followed the same logic as the ones in her notebook. Her pulse quickened. The realization struck her like lightning. What these scholars were calling an ancient unknown code was, in truth, the language of her people. And she, the girl everyone ignored, was perhaps the last living person who could read it, but the moment wasn't yet hers to claim. The hall still buzzed with quiet laughter and whispered dismissal. Her mother tugged her sleeve, trying to pull her away, terrified her daughter might say something that would make things worse. The girl hesitated, her eyes flicking between the glowing screen and the man who had mocked her. Every second felt heavier than the last, yet, even as she turned to leave, her mind was no longer quiet. The symbols burned behind her eyelids, forming sentences she could almost understand. She knew this wasn't over. As the audience refocused on the professor's voice, the girl's silence became a seed of defiance. The hall returned to its rhythm of empty theories and pompous laughter, but she knew what they didn't. The answer they sought wasn't buried in books or archives. It was carried through generations in whispers, lullabies and stories told under dim light, and soon, the language that had once hidden in shadows would step into the light again, through her. The girl stood in silence, her heart pounding like a drum, echoing through the vast hall. The professor's words still lingered in the air, smug and heavy with mockery. Her mother tugged at her sleeve again, whispering for her to let it go, but something inside the girl refused to stay quiet this time. She had spent years listening while others spoke, watching as the world dismissed people like her, too poor, too dark, too small to matter. But now, surrounded by minds that claimed to know everything, she saw what they couldn't. Every line on the screen called to her like an old song waiting to be sung. Taking a trembling breath, she stepped forward. Her voice, soft but steady, broke through the room's chatter. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her accent clear, her tone respectful. The professor froze mid-sentence, irritated at the interruption. All eyes turned toward the girl. The hush that fell over the hall was sharp and expectant. Even the sound of her mother's breath seemed too loud. "I think," the girl continued carefully, "you might be reading it the wrong way." A few people chuckled under their breath, assuming it was another innocent mistake. The professor raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a smirk. "Is that so?" he said mockingly. "And what would you suggest, my dear? Should we read it backwards or upside down?" Laughter flickered again, but this time it sounded uneasy. The girl didn't flinch. Her gaze stayed fixed on the glowing symbols behind him. "It's not Old Portuguese," she said quietly. "It's not even European. The symbols aren't letters, they're directions. My great-grandfather used to draw marks like that when he told stories about the old days." The laughter stopped. A few scholars shifted in their seats. The professor frowned, crossing his arms. "Your great-grandfather told stories, did he? And you think they match a centuries-old inscription found in the mountains?" His voice was dripping with sarcasm, but she ignored it. She took a few steps closer to the projector screen, her hand trembling slightly as she pointed at one of the curved lines near the top. "This one," she said, "isn't a letter. It's a marker for water. And this," she pointed again, "means a place to hide. Together, they say, path that disappears. My great-grandfather said our ancestors used symbols like these to guide each other when they escaped. They created a language no one else could read, so they could find freedom without being caught." A murmur swept through the audience. Heads leaned forward. Someone near the front whispered, "That actually fits the syntax." The professor stiffened, his smirk fading slightly. "That's a charming story," he said, forcing a smile, "but we deal in facts here, not family legends." The girl met his eyes. Legends survive because someone wrote them in ways others couldn't destroy. Her words carried a calm weight that made several scholars glance uneasily at one another. Without another word, she reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out an old notebook, its leather cover cracked with age. She opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with markings and faded ink. He called it the language of the lost, she said softly. He said it was our history, hidden so it couldn't be erased. The room leaned into silence. Even the professor took a step closer, curiosity flickering behind his disdain. The girl turned a few pages, tracing her finger along one of the lines. "Look," she said. "This shape here, it's the same as the one on your screen. And this sequence, it's identical. Only he wrote beside it what it meant. It's not just words, it's a map made of language." A senior scholar near the front rose slowly from his seat, squinting at the notes. "May I see that?" he asked. The girl hesitated for a moment, then nodded and handed it over. The man studied the pages, his eyes widening. "This is structured linguistics," he murmured in awe. "These aren't random marks. This is an entire syntax system." The room erupted into low voices, shocked murmurs bouncing from one scholar to another. The professor tried to regain control. "Coincidence," he said sharply. "Old markings and local folklore, nothing more." But no one was listening to him anymore. The senior scholar turned another page and froze. His lips parted in disbelief. "Wait," he whispered. "These notes, these belong to Samuel Santos." At the mention of the name, the air itself seemed to shift. Dozens of scholars gasped quietly. Samuel Santos, the lost genius, the linguist whose groundbreaking work on Afro-Brazilian dialects had shaped modern linguistic studies. His theories had been quoted for decades, yet his original notes had been lost after his death. The professor himself had built his career citing Santos's early research. Now, the girl's notebook carried his handwriting. The senior scholar looked up slowly. "Where did you get this?" The girl took a deep breath. "He was my great-grandfather." Gasps rippled through the room. The professor stumbled back a step, his confidence cracking. "That's impossible," he blurted out. "Santos never had any surviving family." "He did," she interrupted softly. "He had a daughter, my grandmother. She kept his stories alive through my mother, and my mother passed them to me." Her voice didn't tremble this time. The weight of generations stood behind it. She turned toward the audience, her words steady and calm. "He said one day people would forget the sound of this language, but they'd still find its marks in the earth. He wanted someone to remember how to read them. I think that's why I'm here." The silence that followed was absolute. The professor opened his mouth, but no words came. Every scholar in that room could see the truth written across her face, and in the notebook now trembling in another man's hands. What they had spent years searching for, she had carried in her pocket while cleaning their floors. For the first time that day, the applause didn't belong to prestige or pride. It belonged to truth, to the girl who dared to speak it, even when the world told her to stay silent. The professor's face had drained of color, his confident posture replaced with an uneasy stillness. He tried to maintain the air of authority that once commanded every room he entered, but his voice betrayed him with a faint tremor. Around him, whispers spread like wildfire. The name Samuel Santos hung in the air, echoing through the minds of every scholar present. The man whose theories they had all built their reputations upon now had a living descendant standing before them, holding the very notebook thought to be lost forever. The professor's pride, built on decades of acclaim and control, began to crumble under the quiet strength of the girl's presence. He straightened abruptly, forcing out a hollow laugh. "This is all very touching," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "But let's not get carried away. Anyone can claim to be related to a famous scholar. A few similar markings in an old notebook don't prove anything." His tone sharpened as he turned toward the senior professor holding the notebook. "We need real verification, not bedtime stories." But the older scholar ignored him, his eyes fixed on the intricate notes within the pages. "These are his," he said softly, his voice firm with certainty. "I studied under Samuel Santos in my early years. I recognize his writing, his pattern system, every detail. There's no mistake." The professor's mask cracked. "You're being sentimental," he snapped. "You all are. Look at her. She's a janitor's daughter pretending to understand a field that takes a lifetime to master." The room froze. The words hung there, raw and cruel, heavier than his arrogance had ever been. The girl didn't move, but the crowd's silence became a judgment in itself. No one spoke, no one laughed. Even those who once chuckled at his jokes now looked away, ashamed. The girl stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "You think knowledge belongs to the few," she said quietly. "But it doesn't. It belongs to those who listen." She turned toward the screen again, her eyes tracing the ancient lines of the inscription. "You've been trying to read it as a language of scholars, but it was never meant for them. It was meant for survival." She reached for the computer controls and zoomed in on the symbols. "This isn't random writing. It's a pattern, a trail. Every mark corresponds to a location described in oral history." She began pointing one by one. "Here, the curved lines mark water. This symbol represents a place where the sun disappears, the west. Together, they form a direction. And if you follow that pattern, it leads you across the old escape routes through Minas Gerais." The audience leaned forward in awe. "It's a map," she said. "A map made of words." Her voice didn't rise, but each syllable carried a strength that filled the hall. "My great-grandfather said the enslaved used this system to guide each other through the wilderness, leaving behind messages that only those who knew the language could read. This inscription wasn't carved for decoration. It was a record, a message of freedom." A murmur of excitement rippled through the scholars. Several rushed toward the stage, their pens scratching rapidly over notepads. Cameras clicked as journalists who had come to cover the conference realized history was unfolding in real time. The girl continued speaking, decoding symbol after symbol, transforming what had seemed like chaos into a masterpiece of hidden communication. Each word she spoke peeled away layers of arrogance that had long shrouded the academic world. The professor's composure shattered completely. "This is absurd," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You're all being fooled by a coincidence. You'll destroy years of serious study with a child's imagination." But even as he spoke, one of the linguists projected the girl's interpretations onto a digital map of Brazil, and the points aligned perfectly with known routes of the Quilombo settlements, places where escaped slaves had lived in secret communities centuries ago. The audience gasped collectively. One professor whispered, "It fits. Every single coordinate fits." Another turned to the girl. "Can you show us the rest?" The professor's shouts grew more frantic. "Stop this nonsense," he demanded, slamming his hand against the podium. "You're all blind. She's nothing but a fraud trying to make a name for herself." His words fell flat. No one believed him anymore. The authority he once wielded like a sword had dulled to nothing but noise. The girl didn't even look at him. She kept decoding the final line of the inscription. "This part," she said softly, "isn't just a direction. It's a memory. It says, 'Where the hidden path meets the sun, those who walked free left their names for the future to find.'" She paused, her voice trembling slightly, not from fear, but from emotion. He meant for this to be found, not by those who looked down on others, but by those who listened to what was forgotten. A wave of applause erupted, spontaneous and unrestrained. It wasn't polite or cautious, it was raw, alive, thunderous. The sound filled the hall, echoing against the walls that had witnessed centuries of arrogance and silence. Cameras flashed as the girl's calm smile appeared on screens across the country. The scholars who had once dismissed her now stood, applauding, some with tears in their eyes. The professor stumbled backward, his eyes darting desperately from one face to another. The admiration he had always received was gone, replaced by a quiet disgust. Reporters surrounded him, microphones thrust toward his face, demanding an explanation for his behavior. But there were no words left for him to hide behind. Every insult he had thrown, every sneer and condescending word, now stood as a mirror of his downfall. Meanwhile, the girl's mother stood at the back of the hall, her hands covering her mouth, tears glistening on her cheeks. She had come to clean floors and serve coffee, yet she now watched her daughter illuminate a truth that had slept for centuries. The girl didn't bask in the applause. She simply bowed her head slightly, as if thanking the ancestors whose voices had guided her here. The professor sank into his chair, staring blankly at the floor as flashes went off around him. His career, his pride, his authority, all of it unraveled in front of the same crowd that had once celebrated his brilliance. And in the silence that followed the applause, one truth became clear to everyone present. Arrogance had met its end, not through anger or revenge, but through knowledge carried by a girl who refused to remain invisible. The hall, still charged with the energy of revelation, began to quiet as the girl stepped once more to the podium. The spotlight caught the calm glow on her face, the same light that had endured ridicule, doubt, and arrogance just hours ago. But now there was something new in her expression, a quiet authority born not from pride, but from truth. She moved to the laptop at the center of the stage and connected it to the projector. The screen flickered, revealing the title of a research paper written in elegant type, Linguistic Pathways of Resistance, Hidden Syntax in Afro-Brazilian Symbolic Language. Below it were two names, L. Silva Santos and Dr. Helena Rhodes, Oxford University. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The scholars leaned forward, squinting at the familiar name that seemed to glow brighter with every second. The girl looked out at them, her voice steady but soft. "Before I was invited here," she said, "I'd already been part of an international project studying this very dialect. It took years of comparison, fieldwork, and collaboration. We found these inscriptions matched a code system believed to have vanished after the 17th century." She paused and turned toward the stunned audience. "You may not have recognized me because in my research correspondence I sign my work as L. Silva Santos." The realization struck the professor first. His face twisted as he whispered her research name under his breath, connecting the dots too late. He had received those emails, several of them, each carefully written, respectful, and full of insight. He had ignored them all, never realizing the sender was the same young woman he dismissed as unworthy of conversation. His arrogance had built a wall that blinded him from the very brilliance that now stood before him. The audience gasped in unison as the girl continued, her tone neither boastful nor cruel, but deeply composed. "I reached out months ago," she said quietly. "I sent proposals, field data, and preliminary results, asking for collaboration with the university's linguistics department, but I never received a reply." Her eyes moved across the hall, not accusing, not bitter, but filled with a kind of profound grace that silenced everyone. "Maybe you didn't see me then. Maybe you weren't meant to. But the truth always finds its way, even when no one's listening." She clicked to the next slide. Detailed maps, charts, and historical connections lit up the screen. Each visual proved her earlier interpretations with irrefutable precision. The senior scholars exchanged glances of awe and admiration. One of them leaned toward another and whispered, "She's rewritten our understanding of the language entirely." But it was more than the discovery. It was the way she spoke, calm, deliberate, and unshaken by the magnitude of the moment. "This language was built out of necessity," she explained. "It carried hope when words were forbidden. Every symbol meant safety, direction, and unity. The people who made it weren't scholars in ivory towers, they were survivors. And today, their voices remind us that knowledge isn't defined by degrees or titles. It's defined by the courage to learn and to share." Her mother, still standing at the back of the hall, pressed her hand to her chest as tears streamed down her face. She had come in simple clothes, prepared to leave unnoticed, but now she watched her daughter command the attention of the brightest minds in the world. The pride in her eyes shone brighter than the stage lights. The girl's presentation continued seamlessly, interweaving evidence, maps, and cultural references. The audience watched in stunned silence, absorbing the gravity of what they were witnessing. When she finally closed her laptop, the hall remained quiet for a long moment before a wave of applause erupted. This time it was not just respect, it was reverence. The applause rose, louder and louder, echoing through the grand hall like thunder. Professors who once dismissed her stood up in admiration, while young students in the crowd clapped until their hands shook. The cameras zoomed in as she stepped back from the podium, her eyes glistening, not from pride but from relief. The truth had spoken, and it had been heard. She bowed slightly, acknowledging the room, and for a fleeting second, her gaze met her mother's. No words passed between them, but everything was understood. The long nights, the sacrifices, the endless faith that something greater waited beyond humiliation. The once arrogant professor sat motionless in the front row, his reputation dissolving with every passing second. The crowd's attention no longer belonged to him. His authority had faded into dust. He looked at the floor, realizing that the applause roaring around him wasn't for his years of work or his self-proclaimed brilliance. It was for the girl he had ridiculed. The same girl whose name, Santos, now shone on every academic screen in the country. Reporters crowded the exits, already sending headlines across the world. Young researcher redefines history. Janitor's daughter reveals hidden language of freedom. Arrogant professor silenced by forgotten legacy. After the applause softened, the girl spoke once more, her final words calm but resonant. "Knowledge was never meant to separate us," she said. "It was meant to connect us, to remind us that every voice, no matter how small or silenced, carries truth. I didn't come here to prove anyone wrong. I came here to remind us that brilliance doesn't ask for permission to exist." With that, she stepped down from the stage. The scholars parted instinctively to let her pass. Some bowed their heads in respect, others reached out to shake her hand. But she only smiled humbly and walked toward her mother, who waited near the door. The two embraced quietly, away from the cameras, away from the noise. Outside, the sky had turned gold with the fading sun, and the crowd still murmured her name. The professor slipped out unnoticed through the side door, his shadow shrinking against the marble walls that once echoed his confidence. His legacy faded, replaced by hers, a legacy born from silence, endurance, and brilliance. That night, the girl's discovery became more than an academic breakthrough. It became a story told in homes, classrooms, and newsrooms around the world. A story of how truth rises, even when buried beneath pride and prejudice. And as the world listened, the forgotten voices of history spoke once more through her, clear, undeniable, and eternal.